He was just fixing the old tractor when his sleeve rolled up. The veterinarian helping with the sick cattle froze when she saw the tattoo on his forearm, not some farm logo or family name, but a skull with crosshairs and a number that made her blood run cold, because she'd seen that exact mark before in a military museum next to a display about America's most legendary snipers. Welcome to SOLDİER STORİERS. Before we dive into this incredible tale of hidden legends and forgotten heroes, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today, and if you believe stories like this deserve to be told. Hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who served in silence. The Meadowbrook Valley stretched out like a green carpet across 37 square miles of some of the most fertile farmland in Nebraska, rolling hills dotted with oak trees, streams that ran clean and cold even in the driest summers, and soil so rich it could grow cornstalks that reached 12 feet tall in a good year. At the heart of this valley sat the Harrison Farm, 143 acres of perfectly maintained cropland, pasture, and woodland that had been in the same family for 4 generations. To anyone driving past on County Road 47, it looked like every other successful farm operation in the Midwest. Neat white farmhouse, red barn that had been repainted every decade since 1943, equipment sheds organized with military precision, and fields laid out in patterns so geometrically perfect they looked like mathematical equations written across the landscape. What visitors didn't know was that the mathematical precision wasn't accidental. James Jim Harrison had been farming this land for 23 years, ever since he'd returned from his final tour overseas and decided that peace was something a man had to create for himself, one season at a time. He was 56 years old now, weathered by sun and wind and decades of physical labor, but still carrying himself with the posture of someone who'd been trained to never let his guard down completely. Jim lived alone in the farmhouse his grandfather had built, though alone wasn't quite accurate. He had 47 head of Black Angus cattle, 2 border collies named Scout and Ranger, and enough wildlife on his property to populate a small nature preserve. He preferred the company of animals to people. Animals didn't ask questions about why a man with his education and obvious intelligence chose to spend his days fixing fence posts and harvesting corn. The town of Meadow, population 2,347, knew Jim as the quiet farmer who paid his bills on time, never caused trouble, and could fix any piece of mechanical equipment in the county. He served on the volunteer fire department, donated anonymously to the church fund every Christmas, and showed up for community barn raisings without being asked. He was respected but not particularly well known, which was exactly how he preferred it. What the people of Meadowbrook didn't know was that Jim Harrison had spent 22 years in the United States Marine Corps, the last 15 of those years as one of the most effective long-range marksmen in military history. His official record listed 127 confirmed kills across 4 different conflicts, but the actual number was classified at a level that most generals didn't have clearance to access. In military circles, where such things were discussed in whispers, he'd been known by the call sign Prairie Ghost, a reference both to his Nebraska origins and his ability to appear and disappear across any terrain without leaving a trace. He'd been the sniper that other snipers studied, the marksman that instructors used as an example when they wanted to explain the difference between good shooting and legendary shooting. But that was Staff Sergeant James Harrison, USMC. The man who farmed in Meadowbrook Valley was just Jim, and Jim had spent 23 years making sure that no one had reason to connect the two identities. His daily routine was simple and consistent. Up at 4:30 a.m. to check on the cattle and assess weather conditions. Breakfast at 5:15, always the same: 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, black coffee, and a quick scan of agricultural reports on his tablet. By 6 a.m. he was in the fields or the barn, working through a maintenance schedule he planned weeks in advance. Jim's farming operation was remarkably successful, though he attributed that to good soil, careful planning, and what he called attention to detail. What he didn't mention was that his attention to detail had been honed by years of calculating wind speed, humidity, temperature variations, and atmospheric pressure to make shots that other marksmen considered impossible. When Jim looked at his cornfields, he didn't just see crops, he saw wind patterns indicated by the movement of leaves at different heights. When he checked his cattle, he wasn't just looking for signs of illness, he was unconsciously scanning for any movement, behavior, or detail that didn't fit the normal pattern. When he planned his planting schedule, he wasn't just considering soil temperature and moisture, he was factoring in variables that most farmers never learned to see. The result was a farm that operated with almost supernatural efficiency. Jim's corn yields were consistently 15% above county averages. His cattle never got sick, his equipment never broke down unexpectedly. His fields were so precisely planted that agricultural extension agents used them as examples when training new farmers. But precision had a price. For 23 years, Jim had lived with a hypervigilance that kept him alive in combat but made peace a constant effort. He still woke up at 3:17 a.m. most nights, automatically scanning his bedroom for threats that weren't there. He still positioned himself with clear sightlines to exits whenever he was in public. He still found himself unconsciously calculating range and wind speed when he saw movement in his peripheral vision. The only person who'd ever gotten close to discovering his secret was his neighbor, Martha Kowalski, who'd noticed that Jim's hunting success was statistically impossible. Every fall, Jim would take one deer with one shot, always a clean kill at what Martha estimated were ridiculously long distances. She'd mentioned it to her husband once, saying there was something about Jim's shooting that seemed different from normal hunting. But Ed had just laughed and said some people were naturally gifted marksmen. Jim had been careful to never give anyone reason to look deeper than that surface explanation, until the day Dr. Sarah Mitchell came to examine his cattle. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had been a large animal veterinarian for 8 years, serving farms across 3 counties with the kind of practical expertise that came from treating everything from prize-winning bulls to backyard chickens. She'd grown up on a dairy farm herself, understood the rhythms and challenges of agricultural life, and had earned a reputation for being able to diagnose problems that stumped other vets. She'd also grown up in a military family. Her father had been an Army Ranger, her uncle a Navy SEAL, and her brother was currently serving his 2nd deployment with the 82nd Airborne. She'd spent enough time around military personnel to recognize certain traits: the way they carried themselves, the way they scanned rooms, the way they used language with precision that suggested tactical training, which was why she'd noticed something unusual about Jim Harrison during her previous visits to his farm. Nothing obvious, nothing that would strike a civilian as out of place, but the way he positioned himself during their conversations, always with clear lines, the way he'd pause and scan the horizon whenever aircraft passed overhead, the way he could estimate distances and describe terrain features with military accuracy when discussing where he'd seen sick wildlife. Dr. Mitchell had been meaning to ask about his background, but Jim Harrison wasn't the type of man who invited personal questions. He was professional, courteous, and completely uninterested in small talk. Their interactions had been limited to veterinary business, cattle health, vaccination schedules, and the occasional consultation about wildlife management on his property. But today was different. Today, Jim's prize bull, Champion, was showing signs of respiratory distress that had Jim genuinely worried. Champion wasn't just livestock, he was the foundation of Jim's breeding program. A 2,400-pound Black Angus worth more than most people's cars. More than that, Jim had raised Champion from a calf, and the big bull had become something approaching a pet. Dr. Mitchell arrived at the Harrison farm at 2:15 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon in September, when the corn was shoulder high and the Nebraska sky stretched blue and endless from horizon to horizon. She found Jim in the barn, standing next to Champion and wearing an expression of concern that she'd never seen on his usually composed face. "He's been breathing heavy since yesterday," Jim explained as Dr. Mitchell set up her equipment. "No fever that I can detect, eating normally, but something's not right." Dr. Mitchell began her examination, noting that Jim's assessment was characteristically accurate. Champion was indeed showing signs of respiratory stress, though the cause wasn't immediately obvious. As she worked, she became aware that Jim was watching her technique with the kind of focused attention that suggested he understood more about veterinary medicine than most farmers. "You've got good instincts," she told him as she listened to Champion's lungs. "A lot of farmers wouldn't have caught this early." "I pay attention," Jim replied simply. 20 minutes into the examination, Dr. Mitchell had identified the problem: early-stage pneumonia that would respond well to antibiotics if treated promptly. As she prepared the injection, she explained the treatment protocol and prognosis to Jim, who absorbed the information with the systematic attention of someone trained to process complex briefings. "He'll need twice daily injections for 7 days, she said, drawing the medication into a large syringe. "I can come back, or if you're comfortable with it, I can show you how to administer them yourself." "I can handle it," Jim said. And something in his voice suggested that handling medical procedures wasn't unfamiliar territory. Dr. Mitchell demonstrated the injection technique, noting that Jim's hands were remarkably steady for a farmer steady. In fact, than many veterinary students she'd trained. As Champion received his first dose of antibiotics, Jim assisted with the kind of calm competence that spoke of experience with medical procedures. That's when the old tractor decided to break down. Jim's 1987 John Deere 4450, the workhorse of his farming operation, chose that moment to develop a hydraulic leak that sprayed fluid across the barn floor. Jim muttered something that might have been profanity in another language and moved toward the tractor to assess the damage. "Let me help," Dr. Mitchell offered, though she knew her expertise was better suited to four-legged patients than mechanical ones. "I've got it," Jim said, pulling a toolbox from a nearby shelf. "Just need to tighten a fitting that's been working loose." He positioned himself beside the tractor's hydraulic system and began working with the focused precision of someone who understood machinery at a fundamental level. The repair required him to reach into a tight space beneath the hydraulic pump, which meant rolling up his sleeves and contorting his body to access the problematic fitting. Dr. Mitchell continued monitoring Champion while Jim worked, but she found herself glancing toward the tractor as Jim's movements revealed a level of mechanical expertise that seemed inconsistent with typical farming knowledge. He wasn't consulting a manual or trial and error testing solutions. He was diagnosing and fixing the problem with the systematic efficiency of someone who'd been trained to maintain complex equipment under pressure. Then Jim rolled up his right with sleeve to get better access to the hydraulic fitting, and Dr. Mitchell saw something that made her forget all about Champion's pneumonia. There, on Jim's forearm, was a tattoo that made her blood run cold. The tattoo was approximately 4 inches long and 2 inches wide, positioned on the inside of Jim's right forearm where it would normally be hidden by long sleeves. It wasn't the kind of decorative tattoo that most people got. No flashy colors, no artistic flourishes, no personal sentiment expressed in flowing script. Instead, it was a precise, technical design rendered in black ink that had faded slightly with age but remained clearly legible. The center was a human skull viewed from the front, with crosshairs overlaid across the image. Not cartoon crosshairs, but the precise reticle pattern of a military-grade telescopic sight. Beneath the skull, in simple block numbers, was 2247, but it was the text around the border that made Dr. Mitchell's breath catch in her throat. Prairie Ghost curved along the top of the design, and USMC Scout Sniper formed an arc along the bottom. The entire tattoo was surrounded by small hash marks, exactly 127 of them. She realized with growing amazement Dr. Mitchell had seen that exact design before, not in person, but in a display case at the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Quantico, Virginia. She'd visited the museum during a veterinary conference 3 years earlier and had been drawn to an exhibit about legendary Marine snipers. The display had included photographs, equipment, and replica tattoos representing different sniper units and individual marksmen. The Prairie Ghost tattoo had been featured prominently, identified as belonging to one of the most effective long-range marksmen in Marine Corps history. According to the museum placard, Prairie Ghost had served in classified operations across multiple conflicts, with confirmed kills at distances that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible with standard military equipment. The number 2247 that she now saw on Jim's arm hadn't been explained in the museum display, but Dr. Mitchell was beginning to understand its significance. If the hash marks represented confirmed kills, 127 of them, then 2247 might represent something else entirely. Maximum engagement distance, perhaps the length of his longest confirmed kill, measured in yards. Dr. Mitchell stood frozen beside Champion, her mind racing to process what she was seeing. The quiet farmer who'd been treating his cattle with obvious expertise, who'd demonstrated mechanical knowledge that suggested military training, who carried himself with the controlled awareness of someone trained for combat. This wasn't just a veteran who'd transitioned to civilian life. This was a legend. Jim continued working on the hydraulic fitting, unaware that his carefully guarded secret had been exposed by something as simple as rolling up his sleeve. He was focused on the mechanical problem, using language that Dr. Mitchell now recognized as military technical terminology applied to civilian equipment. Fittings stripped, he said, examining the problematic component. Need to replace the O-ring and retorque to spec. Dr. Mitchell found her voice, though it came out slightly hoarse. Jim, that tattoo on your arm. Jim's hands stopped moving. He didn't look up from the tractor, but Dr. Mitchell could see his entire posture change. Not defensive, exactly, but suddenly alert in a way that suggested he was calculating options and responses. What about it? He asked quietly. I've seen that design before at the Marine Corps Museum in Quantico. Jim slowly straightened up and turned to face her, his expression carefully neutral. For a long moment, they looked at each other across the barn, the only sounds coming from Champion's slightly labored breathing and the distant lowing of cattle in the pasture. Museum, huh? Jim said finally. The sniper exhibit. They had a section about legendary marksmen. Dr. Mitchell paused, trying to find the right words. Prairie Ghost was featured pretty prominently. Jim nodded once, acknowledging what could no longer be denied. That was a long time ago. The longest confirmed kill in Marine Corps history, Dr. Mitchell said, remembering the museum display. 2,247 yards. Afghanistan, 2006. Jim's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his recognition that this conversation had moved beyond the point where deflection or denial would be effective. 2,251 yards, he corrected quietly. The museum got it wrong, but close enough. Dr. Mitchell felt like she was standing in the presence of military history. The man she'd known as a quiet, competent farmer was apparently one of the most skilled marksmen who'd ever served in the United States military. The implications were staggering. Why here? She asked. Why farming? Jim looked out through the open barn doors toward his fields, where corn stood in mathematically perfect rows, stretching toward the horizon. Because it's quiet, because it's honest work, because nobody asks questions about why a man wants to be left alone. Do people know in town? I mean, no, and I'd prefer to keep it that way. Dr. Mitchell nodded, understanding instinctively that she'd been entrusted with information that Jim Harrison had spent 23 years keeping secret. Your secret's safe with me. I appreciate that. Jim turned back to the tractor. Champion's going to be fine. By the way, pneumonia's caught early. Antibiotics will clear it up in a week. It was a clear signal that the conversation about his military service was over, but Dr. Mitchell found herself unable to let it go entirely. The precision farming, she said. The way your fields are laid out, the mathematical accuracy of everything you do here, that's not traditional agriculture, is it? Jim paused in his work and looked at her with something that might have been respect. You notice a lot. I grew up around military people. I recognized the signs. Dr. Mitchell checked Champion's vital signs one more time, then began packing her equipment. For what it's worth, your transition to civilian life seems pretty successful. Most days, Jim replied. As Dr. Mitchell prepared to leave, she found herself reluctant to end the conversation. Meeting a living legend wasn't something that happened every day, and her curiosity about Jim's story was overwhelming her professional discretion. Can I ask you something? She said as Jim finished repairing the hydraulic leak. Jim looked at her expectantly, neither encouraging nor discouraging the question. The farming operation here, it's incredibly sophisticated, more precise than anything I've seen in 8 years of rural practice. That's not something you learn from agricultural extension courses, is it? Jim wiped his hands on a shop rag and considered his answer carefully. Farming requires the same skills as long-range shooting. You have to read weather patterns, understand ballistics, calculate 4 variables that most people never think about. Wind speed, humidity, temperature gradients, even atmospheric pressure, they all affect how things behave over distance. So you applied military training to agriculture. I applied military training to staying sane, Jim corrected. Farming gave me something to focus on that wasn't about taking lives, but the skills transfer. Dr. Mitchell looked around the barn with new appreciation. The organization wasn't just neat, it was tactical. Equipment positioned for maximum efficiency, sightlines maintained to all entrances, everything arranged so that Jim could locate whatever he needed quickly and without conscious thought. The cattle operation, she said, beginning to understand. You're not just raising beef cattle, you're maintaining a breeding program with genetic precision that rivals university research facilities. Jim nodded. Selective breeding requires the same kind of systematic analysis as mission planning. You identify objectives, assess variables, execute strategy, and measure results. And the wildlife management, population control, is population control. Whether you're dealing with enemy combatants or coyotes threatening livestock, the principles are the same. Dr. Mitchell was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of what Jim was telling her. You've created a civilian life that uses all your military skills but applies them to constructive purposes. That was the idea. How's it working? Jim looked out at his fields again, considering the question. Most days good, some days harder. The skills don't turn off just because you're not in combat anymore. Hypervigilance, among other things. Jim's answer was careful, but Dr. Mitchell caught the implication that there were aspects of his military service that continued to affect his daily life. Have you ever considered that your story might help other veterans transitioning to civilian life? Jim's expression became guarded. I'm not interested in being anyone's example or inspiration. I came here to disappear, not to be found. Dr. Mitchell understood, but she also recognized something that Jim might not have considered. What if it's not about being found? What if it's about helping other people disappear successfully? Jim looked at her with genuine curiosity for the first time in their conversation. I work with a lot of rural veterans, Dr. Mitchell explained. Guys who came back from deployment and tried to build lives in small towns where nobody understands what they've been through. Some of them are struggling, some of them are failing, and you think my farming operation could be some kind of model. I think your farming operation proves that military skills can be successfully redirected toward peaceful purposes. I think the way you've structured your life here demonstrates that it's possible to find meaning and purpose without abandoning the precision and discipline that kept you alive in combat. Jim was quiet for several minutes, absently stroking Champion's neck while he considered Dr. Mitchell's words. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that suggested he'd thought about this before. I've had good days and bad days out here. Days when the work feels meaningful and days when it feels like I'm just hiding from reality. But I've never had a day when I regretted choosing this life over the alternatives. What alternatives? Private, military contracting, training other snipers, consultation work for law enforcement. Jim paused. Jobs that would have paid better but kept me in the world I was trying to leave behind. Dr. Mitchell began to understand the discipline required for Jim's transition. He'd walked away from career options that would have capitalized on his military expertise in favor of creating something entirely different. Do you miss it? The military life? Jim's answer came without hesitation. I miss the brotherhood. I miss working with people who understood the stakes and knew their jobs inside and out. I miss the clarity of having clear objectives and the resources to accomplish them. But I don't miss the weight of other people's lives in my hands. I don't miss making decisions where the wrong choice means good people don't come home. I don't miss the kind of stress that never lets you sleep through the night. Dr. Mitchell packed the last of her veterinary equipment and prepared to leave, but she had one more question. The name Prairie Ghost, where did that come from? Jim almost smiled. My spotter gave it to me after a mission in Afghanistan. Said, I moved across open ground like I was part of the landscape, and enemies never saw me coming until it was too late. The name stuck, and now you're actually working the prairie. Different kind of hunting, Jim said. Different kind of precision, but the same attention to detail. Dr. Mitchell left the Harrison farm that afternoon with a new understanding of both veterinary medicine and the hidden costs of military service. Jim's transition from legendary sniper to successful farmer represented something remarkable, proof that the skills developed in combat could be channeled toward creation rather than destruction. Over the following weeks, as she continued treating Champion's pneumonia and monitoring his recovery, Dr. Mitchell found herself observing Jim's operation with professional interest that went beyond veterinary concerns. She began to recognize the sophisticated management systems he'd developed, the way military precision had been adapted to agricultural challenges. Jim's cattle rotation followed patterns that optimized grazing while maintaining soil health, strategy that required the same kind of systematic planning he'd once applied to mission logistics. His equipment maintenance schedules were detailed enough to prevent mechanical failures before they occurred, eliminating the kind of unexpected breakdowns that could compromise operational effectiveness. Most impressively, his crop yields consistently exceeded county averages despite using fewer chemical inputs than neighboring farms. When Dr. Mitchell asked about his agricultural techniques, Jim explained that he'd learned to read environmental conditions with the precision required for long-range shooting, allowing him to optimize planting and harvesting timing in ways that most farmers never considered. Weather prediction is weather prediction, he told her during one of her visits. Whether you're calculating wind drift for a 1,200-yard shot or determining the optimal time to harvest corn, you're analyzing the same atmospheric variables. Dr. Mitchell began to document Jim's techniques, initially for her own curiosity, but gradually with the recognition that his methods represented innovative approaches to sustainable agriculture. She also began to understand the therapeutic value of farming for someone with Jim's background. The work is immediate and tangible, Jim explained when she asked about the psychological benefits of agricultural life. You plant seeds, you tend them, you harvest the results. There's direct cause and effect, clear objectives, measurable outcomes. It's honest work that produces something constructive. Unlike military service, Jim's expression became thoughtful. Military service was necessary and honorable, but it was also destructive by definition. Even when we were protecting good people and eliminating genuine threats, the work was fundamentally about ending lives rather than creating them. And farming is about creation. Farming is about nurturing life, taking responsibility for the health and well-being of living things, using the same attention to detail and systematic planning to grow food instead of planning missions. Dr. Mitchell began to see Jim's farm as a form of therapy that he'd unconsciously designed for himself. The hypervigilance that had kept him alive in combat was redirected toward monitoring crop and livestock health. The tactical planning skills were applied to agricultural management. The physical conditioning requirements were met through demanding farm labor. Most importantly, the isolation that allowed him to process his military experiences without external pressure also provided the space necessary for psychological healing. 3 months after first seeing Jim's tattoo, Dr. Mitchell made a decision that would change both their lives. She approached him with a proposal that she'd been developing since their conversation in the barn. I want to write about your farming operation, she told him during a routine visit to check on Champion, who had made a full recovery and was back to his normal dominant behavior in the pasture. Jim's response was immediate and predictable. No, not about your military service, Dr. Mitchell clarified. About your agricultural techniques, the way you've adapted systematic planning and environmental analysis to sustainable farming. Jim looked at her suspiciously. Why? Because you've developed methods that could help other farmers increase productivity while reducing environmental impact, and because I think the structured approach you've taken to civilian transition could help other veterans who are struggling with similar challenges. I'm not interested in publicity. Neither am I. I'm interested in practical applications of innovative farming techniques. Dr. Mitchell paused, choosing her words carefully. What if we focused entirely on the agricultural science? No mention of military background, no personal history, just technical analysis of your methods. Jim considered this for several minutes, watching his cattle graze in pastures that showed no signs of overuse despite supporting more animals per acre than conventional wisdom suggested was sustainable. What kind of writing? Agricultural journal articles, technical papers for farming conferences. Maybe eventually a manual for veterans transitioning to agricultural careers, but focused on practical techniques rather than personal stories. And you'd keep my identity confidential. Completely, you'd be listed as a consulting researcher, nothing more. Jim made his decision with characteristic directness. Send me your first draft. I think it reveals more than I'm comfortable with. The project ends, Dr. Mitchell agreed, and 6 months later, her first paper on precision agriculture techniques was published in the Journal of Sustainable Farming. The article, titled Military-Inspired Systematic Approaches to Agricultural Management, became one of the most requested reprints in the journal's history. 2 years after Dr. Mitchell first saw Jim's tattoo, the Harrison farm had become an unofficial research facility for sustainable agriculture techniques. Jim remained anonymous in all published materials, but his methods were being studied and replicated by farmers across the Midwest. The precision planting techniques he'd developed were reducing seed waste by an average of 12% while improving crop yields. His livestock rotation strategies were being adopted by ranchers who wanted to improve pasture health while increasing carrying capacity. His equipment maintenance protocols were being taught at agricultural colleges as examples of preventive management. Most significantly, the structured approach to agricultural transition was being used to help military veterans develop successful farming careers. Dr. Mitchell had established a consultation program that connected veterans interested in agriculture with mentors who understood both farming challenges and military transition issues. Jim remained on his farm, continuing to live the quiet life he'd built for himself, but he'd also become a resource for veterans who needed guidance in channeling military skills toward constructive civilian purposes. He provided consultation anonymously, sharing techniques and strategies without revealing his identity or personal history. The transformation was subtle but profound. Jim had discovered that helping others transition successfully provided the same sense of mission accomplishment that he'd experienced in military service, but without the psychological cost of combat operations. It turns out, he told Dr. Mitchell during one of their regular conversations, that teaching people to build things is just as satisfying as teaching them to destroy things, maybe more satisfying. Dr. Mitchell continued her veterinary practice, but also became a recognized expert in agricultural innovation and veteran transition issues. She spoke at conferences, published research papers, and consulted with government agencies on policies supporting veteran agriculture programs. Her most important work remained her regular visits to the Harrison farm, where she and Jim continued developing techniques that proved military precision could be successfully applied to peaceful purposes. Champion, fully recovered from his pneumonia, had become the foundation of a breeding program that was producing some of the finest black Angus cattle in the region. The big bull seemed to understand his importance, carrying himself with a dignity that suggested he knew he was living on a farm operated by someone who never settled for anything less than excellence. The cornfields stretched toward the horizon in mathematically perfect rows, testament to the precision of someone who understood that success required attention to details that most people never noticed. The pastures supported more cattle per acre than conventional wisdom suggested was possible, managed by someone who could read environmental conditions with the accuracy of a man whose life had once depended on such skills. And in the farmhouse that his grandfather had built, Jim Harrison continued living the life he'd chosen: quiet, productive, and peaceful. He'd successfully transitioned from being one of America's most effective warriors to being one of Nebraska's most innovative farmers. Most importantly, he'd proved that the skills developed in military service could be channeled toward creation rather than destruction, that warriors could become builders, and that the precision required for long-range shooting could be applied to long-term farming with remarkable success. The Prairie Ghost had found peace in the prairie itself, turning his legendary skills toward nurturing life instead of ending it, and in doing so, he'd created something that would outlast any military achievement, a legacy of teaching others that there was always another way to serve.